This is the app we worked on thus far, this shop app, and attached you find this snapshot, which includes authentication in case you didn't follow the previous modules or you don't want to follow them. Just be aware that for this to work, you of course need a Firebase backend, and in your files you need to adjust my Firebase URLs with your Firebase URLs and your Firebase API keys, for example. So you'll have to make these adjustments in all these provider files here. Make sure to set up your Firebase project and use your URLs if you're taking my attached snapshot. And with that, what could we animate here? Well, I'd say we start right here on the off screen. When I switch to sign up mode and back to login, we have this jump here, right? We simply increase the box height and then we shrink it again. And whilst this of course does work and certainly it's obvious to the user what changed, we might still want to improve that a little bit, for example, by gradually animating this container and sliding and fading the confirm password field in, for example. And that's of course just one idea of how you could animate this, but it's exactly what I want to build together with you here to give you an idea for how this could work. For that, let's go to the screens and there to the off screen, of course, because that is the screen where I want to add animations. And in there we have a stateful widget. We have our off screen, which is a stateless widget, but then we have the off card, and that's a stateful widget. And that's this white box in the middle here, which is the thing I want to animate. Now, it's good that this is a stateful widget, because for full control, or for this approach of controlling an animation from scratch, you need a stateful widget. Because the way animations work in Flutter is basically that Flutter updates the screen 60 times per second, so every 16 milliseconds, basically. And animations work such that we continuously change something in our state, change some value, and change that with every frame update, so every 16 milliseconds, so that we can then change something in the screen every 16 milliseconds. For example, the height of the container. And because we change it so often, to the human eye, it looks like a smooth animation, a smooth transition, even though we technically just change the height of the container here, as I just said, every 16 milliseconds. Now, of course, a basic way of building an animation therefore would be in our state object here, in our state class, to have some property, which could be our container height, let's say, which initially is a base height. Let's have a look at the height I set up down there, 260. So that could be our base height, which we set up here. And now we need some timer, basically an interval which fires every 16 milliseconds, and then we add something to that height so that we reach 320, which is our end height, by the end of 60 times 16 milliseconds, so by the end of 1 second. We could do that. We could manage this manually like this, but of course Flutter thankfully has better tools for helping us with that. So when you build fully controlled, so controlled by you, animation with Flutter, you typically start by setting up an animation controller. And I'll store it here in a controller _controller variable. And please note, this is a variable. I just used the type instead of the var keyword because I'm not initializing this with a value, and hence the type would otherwise be unknown to Dart. An animation controller, of course, is a class provided by Flutter that helps us with, well, controlling animations, as the name suggests. Now, the controller is one thing. We also need to set up an animation object. And since I plan on animating the height, or in other words, the size of a container, animation is a generic type where we have to tell Dart or Flutter what we want to animate. So here I want to animate the size, and size is another class, just like animation, provided by Flutter, so by the material Dart file, which I'm importing at the top. And I'll name this height animation. The name, of course, is totally up to you. So now we got a controller, which we can later use to start or revert the animation. And then we got the animation itself, which will in the end do all the heavy lifting of changing a value over time. Now, both should be configured when this state object is created. So I'll add init state here. And in init state, I want to set up my controller and I want to set up the height animation. So let's first of all assign a value to the controller. And here we instantiate a new animation controller using that animation controller class. And the animation controller now should get at least two values here. The first one is the vsync value. Now vsync, in a nutshell, basically is an argument where we give the animation controller a pointer at the object, the widget in the end, which it should watch, and only when that widget is really visible on the screen, the animation should play. So this optimizes performance because it ensures that we really only animate what's visible to the user. So I want to point at this widget, or at this state object, which belongs to a widget, of course, which has a build method. And for this to work, I just need to add a mix in here. So we add the with keyword after extending the state. And what I import here is the single ticker provider state mixin. Complicated name, in the end provided by Material Dart from the Flutter package. And what this does in the end is it simply adds a couple of methods and properties here. And what this does, if we have a look at it, it simply adds a method here, or a couple of methods actually, to this class here, to this state class, which is then implicitly used by vsync or by the animation controller to find out whether that's currently visible and so on. So we add this. The other thing I add here, or the other thing I want to configure on the controller, is the duration of the animation. And you could also specify a separate reverse duration in case you want to have different durations for playing the animation forward and backward. If you don't specify different durations, the duration here will be used for both directions. Now here you simply create a duration object with the duration class, and you can set this to whatever you want. I'll set it to 300 milliseconds, which is a typical duration for animations. You don't want to make these too long, of course. Users shouldn't wait for that to finish. It just should be just long enough to show the user what happened without blocking user input. So that's the controller. Now for the animation itself, for the height animation. The height animation here is set up with another class provided by Flutter, the tween class. The tween class, when you instantiate it, gives you an object which in the end knows how to animate between two values. So tween because of between. Tween is a generic class because there are different things you can animate between. For example, you could offset a container or anything like that to have it slide in. Here I want to animate the size, and now tween, the constructor here, has two arguments which you should provide, the begin and the end named argument. For begin you define a size, and size here has a size, has two arguments, width and height. I don't want to animate the width, so I'll set this to double infinity for beginning and for ending. But for the height here, I want to start at 260, and then for end, I want to set up a size where I also don't change the width, so the width still is double infinity, but then we have 320 as the ending height. And these are the heights I'm assigning to my container down there. Here, when we're in sign-up mode, I set this to 320, otherwise it has a height of 260. So that is just what I control up there. Now, tween itself doesn't give us an animation though, it just has the information on how to animate between two values. To create an animate object based on this, you have to call animate, and now pass in an animation object, which will basically wrap itself around this information on what to animate, and the animation object describes how to animate it. Here you typically use a curved animation by simply creating it here with the curved animation constructor. And curved animation now also needs to be configured. You need to inform this curved animation what its parent is, and that simply is the controller by which it should be controlled. So you point at underscore controller, and then we have the duration, we have the what, so what to animate. The missing thing is the curve here for curved animation. That simply defines how the duration time here is basically split. The default here, of course, would be curves.linear. Curves simply is a helper class with a couple of static properties, and linear means that it simply moves between the begin and end value here in the same speed. But you can also, for example, set this to ease in or fast out, slow in, which means it starts slow and ends fast. And typically you want to experiment with these different values to find an animation between these start and end values that looks good. So now with that, we got the animation set up and the controller. Now we just need to connect that to our widget down there. We do connect this here to this container by no longer having our if condition here. So I'll copy that so that we still can see the old mode here or the old code. Instead here, we assign this to height animation dot value, and there dot height, of course. And this will change over time as soon as we start the animation. The same here for the box constraints, where I set up a minimum height. We also change this to our height here, so that the minimum height changes dynamically. And the difference to the old code is that we don't suddenly change from 260 to 320. Instead, we smoothly animate there. But of course, we now need to kick off this animation. And we do that in switch off mode. Instead of just switching the off mode here, we want to make sure that when we do go to the sign up mode, we increase the height, and therefore we should use our controller here and call forward. Forward starts the animation. Now, and once you're done, you want to play that back. So here you simply call controller reverse. So when you're going back to login mode, you want to reverse the animation to shrink the container again. Now with that added, we're almost there. There's still one more thing missing. We also have to go to the place where we define the height animation, so in the init state. And there, we also now need to add a listener to call setState whenever this updates, and it should update whenever it redraws the screen. So here, in the end, we just have an anonymous function in which we call setState, and to setState we can pass an empty update function because there isn't really something I want to update. I just want to rerun the build method to redraw the screen. And with that, that here should be milliseconds, otherwise we'll not really see an animation. That would be far too short, so milliseconds, not microseconds. And with that, if I now do a full refresh, you see this is now getting animated. You see the container now is animated. Now, of course, it's pretty cumbersome if we always have to add our own listener here. And by the way, we should not just set up a listener here, we should also dispose of it when the widget is removed, when the state is removed. So we should add dispose here, and inside of dispose, we should also call controller dispose to make sure that we clean the listener and so on. Now with that, we could control the height here and we would animate it, but of course it's pretty cumbersome to manually set up the listener, assign the height down there, and so on. And thankfully, Flutter has built-in widgets that make it easier for us. It is important, however, to understand what happens behind the scenes and that you have a controller and an animation play together. Controller simply controls, starts, configures, and so on the animation. Animation then decides how to animate between which values. And then you use the animation simply wherever you want to use that dynamically changed value, which changes very often per second, somewhere in your widget tree. Now, of course, keep in mind that build reruns for every frame, therefore. So every 16 milliseconds, build reruns and things did change on the UI. So you want to make sure that you really only rebuild the things that do need updating, and you want to make sure that you, update as efficiently as possible. So let's have a look at that, and therefore at the first built-in widget, which helps us with animations, before we then progress further into built-in widgets and how we can animate other things as well.